Tit, or the English pronunciation Tëlek, is my first Conlang. I have the same opinion that Bibliridion has of his first Conlang. The first and worst Conlang I have ever made. Indeed, Tëlek is better classified as a Relex of English. This shortfall of quality is primarily because the language was an extension of an alphabet I made while in art class, because I was, and still am, fascinated by the fact that the shapes of letters are arbitrary. For instance, the Hebrew script is derived from the same Phoenician script that the Latin alphabet comes from. My alphabet eventually pushed me to make a language for it. But this original alphabet, after some revisions, was eventually thrown out entirely after I realized two things. 1. The alphabet looked too similar to both the English and Greek alphabets. And 2, I'd watched Xidnaf's video on Hangul. The idea of making sounds like each other have similar shapes was revolutionary to me. Consequently, the writing system was reworked into a featural alphabet, written left to right and down. Though, unlike Hangul, the symbols were themselves versions of some of the old symbols from the original alphabet, or entirely new, rather than abstractions of the mouth shape when making the sounds. I didn't want the writing system to resemble Hangul. Having it resemble another the same way the original non-featural alphabet did would put me back at square one. Now, I don't know how to classify this Conlang because I don't know if there's a real abbreviation for personal constructed language, but I shorten it to Purslang. It's also meant to be a semi-Natlang for its minor amount of lore, but it's not evolved from a proto-language. I wonder, however, if my classification of what a Natlang is correct, because the Conlang Orojun by Nga or Agma Schwa, link in description, is clearly a Natlang despite not being evolved from an original proto-language. However, it has a great deal of lore as it pertains to its world. All I know about it as a Natlang, about Tëlek as a Natlang, what I can remember is that the people live in the modern day and on an island somewhere south of the Socotra archipelago, off the coast of Somalia. Why I chose the waters off the coast of Somalia is lost to me. Here's the phonology that I was able to reconstruct from my alphabet conversions. I made this language before I understood and could use the IPA, so some of the representations from that time don't make too much sense to anybody but me at the time. As a result, some of this is guesswork. However, some is memory combined with my current knowledge of how to classify phonemes. And in one case, I had the foresight to write the name of the IPA phone, the sound it is supposed to be. Oh, and quick side note, I found after putting the phonology into an IPA chart that I quite liked some parts of it. As a result, I ended up making what is hands down my favorite phonological inventory. I'll have a link to it in the description. Now back to the show. This video will primarily focus on the tidbits of vocab and the phonology because there's no great text to look at like with Sadhu. I only ever wrote a few example sentences, and further because the grammar is that of English, but with things like tense marking fully regularized with a suffix and definiteness not being marked. Okay, so first I'm gonna talk about Tëlek's phonology, followed by its featural alphabet, romanization, and lastly, the two surviving example sentences. Tëlek's phonology is, as a naturalistic language, a straight-up failure. However, assessed not as a Natlang, but for not wanting to copy English without the ability to make a lot of sounds, I'd say it barely passes. I'd just learned about the click languages of the Kalahari Desert, so I decided to include a click. A click. One click. All click languages have several clicks, never just one. A quick search of any of the Khoisan languages' phonology says as much. Further, the lateral click I now use to pronounce Xhosa, which I remember as being the same as in was not the click I originally used. Rather, I use this clickish sound I learned from my aunt, just a sound she made. She doesn't speak a click language, where the tongue would be placed in the position of for either of the alveolar stops, after which the tongue would be flattened and tensed, then released, whereby it would slap down onto the inside of the jaw, like so. Tëlek doesn't have the voiced alveolar nasal na, which isn't unheard of, but still much rarer than not having the voiced velar nasal nga, another phoneme that Tëlek doesn't have. Despite this lack of nasals, this Conlang features two prenasalized phonemes, the prenasalized bilabial stop and the prenasalized labial dental fricative. I don't really know if this is particularly as bad as with my one-click consonant, but they contribute to a lack of naturalistic symmetry in the sound chart. I can, though, explain why I had prenasalized stops at all. At the time, I was playing Civ 6, specifically as the Congo. Therefore, I'd have been exposed to words and names like mbanza or mve, mba, nzing, nga. Thereby, I became quite interested in prenasalized consonants. Now, before I address the elephant, I'm going to talk about the voiciness of the stops and ejectives. All plain stops, which are aspirated when unvoiced, because I didn't even know what aspiration was at the time, have a voiciness distinction except for the voiceless alveolar stop, breaking an established pattern. A pattern that would be unnecessary if not for the ejectives being messed up too. Tëlek has both a bilabial and alveolar ejective, but not a velar ejective, again breaking the established pattern. If these ejectives completed the labial alveolar velar triad, then the voiciness distinction wouldn't even be necessary. Just as I began with one of the worst parts of the phonology, I'll end with one of the worst parts. The complete lack of any open vowels. In other words, none that resemble an open-fronted, unrounded vowel. I only know of one language that doesn't have any open vowels, except I can't find its name, nor can I find the video I heard about it in. I can't even explain this decision, except that the phoneme must have slipped my mind, or I was clueless as to the gravity of leaving out such a type of vowel. As you can see with this featural alphabet, the general shapes of all of the letters are defined by how similar I thought them to be. Considering my lack of knowledge at the time on how sounds are made, it's kind of interesting that my base letter shapes actually line up pretty well with the places of articulation that I now know about. The alveolar area has its own K-like shape. Similarly, the labials, velars, and nasal-esque sounds have their own shape, with the vowels also classified into their own shape. The phoneme that seems out of place is the R sound, which is often analyzed as the voiced alveolar approximate R. However, it is truly the voiced post-alveolar approximate R. Further, as Jan Misali mentioned in his video about futurese, it is often labialized and sometimes even velarized. From my current analyzation, which is admittedly shaky, my idiolect, if not my dialect, utilizes a velarized, labialized, voiced post-alveolar approximate, R. It is this velarization that likely caused me to classify the R sound with the other velar phonemes. However, in trying to justify its classification, I may very well be hearing a velarization that isn't there. Yet, I feel where my tongue is, and it is almost identical to one I'm making, for example, the unvoiced velar stop, ga. The sound that doesn't have its own letter is the glottal stop, because there are no diphthongs, so it is implied when vowels are next to each other. It's confusing because this rule applies to the romanization too, which in the case of the close mid-front unrounded vowel uses 2 vowel letters to represent one phoneme. Anyways, the names of the letters are derived like this. For consonants, the sound the letter makes followed by the close mid-front unrounded vowel, I, makes the letter's name. And for vowels, the vowel sound the letter makes followed by the voiced alveolar lateral approximate, la, makes the vowel letter's name. One thing that kind of relates, for some reason the tense markers received their own syllabic symbols, rather than just being written out with the alphabet. I don't have too much to say about the romanization system. For what it's supposed to transcribe, it is fairly straightforward. My only criticism of past me's decisions for romanization is that of the unvoiced alveolar lateral click, ah, after a vowel, and the close mid-front unrounded vowel, I. While I'm fairly okay with digraphs in cases where they can't be avoided, trigraphs are where I draw a hard line of no. Yet the unvoiced alveolar lateral click after a vowel is represented apostrophe LK. Thankfully, this is the first and last trigraph I've ever used for romanization. I guess because it is my only trigraph, 2 years later I still remember my train of thought as to why. The L is because it is made similarly to the voiced alveolar lateral approximate, and the K is because the click has a similar level of hardness. For the apostrophe, the unvoiced alveolar lateral click is always preceded by the glottal stop, ah, when after a vowel. To my knowledge, at the time, the glottal stop was exclusively represented with an apostrophe. It was, therefore, included. However, the fact that I include this apostrophe for the glottal stop doesn't make any sense because, as I said earlier, the glottal stop is implied between vowels because there are no diphthongs, both for the romanization and the featural alphabet. So couldn't it also be implied when the click came after a vowel? As for my other criticism, EI, representing the close mid-front unrounded vowel, was the result of pronouncing what I understood to be the A sound and realizing it was a diphthong, A, rather than the pure close mid-front unrounded vowel, I. Keep in mind, I was doing the phonetic analysis in English with my northern city's dialect accent, rather than with my accent for speaking Spanish, or Tëlek for that matter. At last, the finale. My verbosity aside, what you're looking at are the only 2 surviving example sentences in Tëlek, which has a grammar ever so slightly distinct enough from English's that I can't make any more true example sentences. I wrote even less down than Sadhu. And compared to Sadhu, which I remember a fair amount of, I remember little more than that it was a slightly simplified English grammar. From these 2 sentences, we can gather several things. General word order is SVO. Question word order is OSV. It changes word order for questions just like English. It is about as analytical as English. We can see, along with the study of the vocab, that Tëlek has parentheses C, no parentheses V, parentheses C, and then possible parentheses over the apostrophe, and then parentheses for the whole thing, LK, syllable structure, and no definiteness marking. By looking at the vocab, we can further gather there is only one form of a person pronoun, and that they are also used as ownership adjectives. As a result, in the lower sentence, it could be inferred through context that the first person singular from the pronoun may own the homework, rather than the homework just being definite. Further, looking at the why do these exist syllabic tense markers, we can see that there are 2 past tenses despite them being pronounced the same. An oversight of mine I didn't catch. One for the farther past and the immediate past. Interestingly, when writing them out, I differentiated the suffixes by denoting the same vowel sound twice using the 2 different symbols I had for that vowel sound. that vowel sound being the close mid-front unrounded vowel. But back to the sentence. By looking at the symbol, we can see that the homework was finished in the immediate past. Funny how, despite the fact I fully regularized the tense marking, I ended up making its written form irregular when writing with the script. Well, that is all. That is the whole language. Whole Relex, more like. Very little is there in comparison to Sadhu, and yet the script is longer by a whole 70 or so words. Anyways, thanks for watching. I hope you can learn from this cautionary tale.